So it gives me great pleasure to introduce today's co-host. She has become a friend, and I'm so excited about the work that she's doing. So I want to give her a formal introduction, as I normally do. And then in our fashion here at NWC, through our Intentional Conversations VodCast, we will invite Carley to unmute herself, and then she will share information that we wouldn't know about her from reading her bio. So we'll get a little bit deeper dive into Carley, her life, her story, and why she has been called to the work that she does. So Carley Hauck is a senior learning architect, leadership development consultant, author, speaker, and serves as an adjunct faculty at Stanford University and UC Berkeley Hall School of Business, teaching on the subject of leadership and business as a platform for positive change in the world. For the last decade, she has served hundreds of leaders and companies in Fortune 100 companies and high growth startups such as LinkedIn, Genentech, Pixar, Cliff Bar, Intuit, Bank of West, etc., to up-level their leadership skills, cultivate their recipes for resilience, team building, and inclusive manager development programs to create thriving workplaces. Carley feels inspired to guide leaders with a new skill set of tools to support the next paradigm of conscious leadership and business. Carley shares her passion for inclusive leadership and creating a workplace and world that works for everyone and prioritizes people and planet first. In her book, Shine, Ignite Your Inner Game to Lead Consciously at Work and the World. And I have to say, I've been gifted with a copy of Carley's book. I'm going to hold it up. And I'm so excited that she today is going to talk with us about some of the concepts in the book, some of the work that she's doing. But I am just delighted to have you. We always say it makes us feel seen, valued, and heard when our guests say yes to our invite. So Carley, thank you so much for sharing space with us today. Greet our audience in your own way.
Thank you. I'm aware I keep looking down because I have my screen up, but Nika, thank you so much for this invitation. Hi, y'all. Nice to meet you all. Thanks for being here. That was a beautiful introduction.
Well, no, thank you. Again, we're just so delighted to spend this time, and we look forward to learning more about your work and what's brought you to this work. And so with that in mind, we always like to ask our guests to tell us about themselves. And this is information that we wouldn't know about you from reading your bio. And I'm often very intrigued by people's DEI story. What are the different intersecting identities that they bring to the work and their connectivity to equity and inclusion? And so will you share that with us, please, Carley?
Sure. Well, my pronouns are she and her, and different identities. So I identify as a practicing Buddhist, but in my mother's lineage, I would be considered Jewish because if my mother's Jewish, my grandmother and grandfather on that side of the family were Jewish. So culturally, we could say, you know, I identify as Jewish. My cousins were Holocaust survivors. I also identify as a auntie and a sister. I also identify as a climate activist / optimist, and also, you know, very much a lover of people and planet. So I'll stop there. But that feels like some of those things. Yeah.
No, that's great. And so you often are associated with this phrase of learning from wholeness. And so I want you to unpack that for this audience, please. Tell us what that means exactly and how does it show forth in the work that you do? Learning from wholeness.
And it's actually leading, because that's the name of my company. So leading from wholeness.
Thank you.
Yeah, you're welcome. You're welcome. So I feel like, you know, we bring our whole selves to work and the world, right? And the more that we can embrace all of our parts, you know, the dark, the light, we all have it. The more that we are able to then actually bring our best and greatest selves forward. But when we're hiding parts of ourselves, when there's shame, when there's those parts that are neglected, often what happens is we're not leading actually from our whole self. And the parts of us that yeah, that we're not willing to bring forth because maybe there's vulnerability. Those get left behind, and then we're not able to actually bring our greatest light. And that's been my experience. And it's, you know, it's humbling to be able to actually just kind of keep taking those masks, those layers off, and just say, okay, this is me, like all of it.
Yeah, no, I love that, Carly. And we do talk often in this space of diversity, equity, and inclusion about the implications of people not feeling like they can bring their whole selves to an environment.
Yeah.
It causes them to mask and to cover portions of their identity.
Mm-hmm.
And honestly, when I really think about that, it saddens me. It saddens me that people cannot feel whole at the core of who they are.
Mm-hmm.
And so, and you said you want people to be able to shine their light. And I'm sure that probably is what led to maybe the title of your book, Shine. Can you talk about that for a moment?
Sure. Thank you. Yeah, I just did another podcast with a dear friend of mine, and she was asking me why Shine. And this was yesterday. And honestly, Shine was the name that she wanted to be called. So I consider there's a she going on with this book for sure. So I was looking for the name, and that's just what came through. And the shine in some ways is because going back to that leading from wholeness is, you know, we have some big problems in our world. You know, we have racial injustice, we have systemic racism and oppression, and we have this big problem that faces all of us in our humanity, which is climate change. And we have an addiction to fossil fuels, and there are systems and structures at work and in the world that need to shift, that need to be hospiced out. And that means that we have to shine the light on them with truth, with love, and say this, you know, got us to where we are, but it's not in service of each other or our, you know, best possibility for our future. And that requires, you know, a certain courage, a certain level of skills to be willing to kind of stand in that and say no, or yes, let's do it over this way. And so that's kind of what I think of shine in a certain regard. And that's what I've, you know, tried to do with this book is show the way.
Mm-hmm. And your subtitle is Ignite Your Inner Game to Lead Consciously at Work and in the World. And I love that. So I want to connect this to the broad topic of diversity, equity, and inclusion, because that's obviously a part of your platform as well. Mm-hmm. And you were gracious enough to extend the invite for me to share on a panel with other individuals as we talked about inclusive leadership and several other topics. That was really valuable. But I want to get you just to talk about the practice, what it looks like to practice conscious and inclusive leadership from your vantage point.
Wonderful. Yeah. And I loved having your participation on that panel. Thank you. Yeah. Had a very strong yes when I knew I needed to bring in a very strong voice on that. So thank you again for joining.
Thank you.
So, you know, as you said in the introduction, I've been working with a lot of these folks at different companies for the last decade. And what I noticed in my time working with leaders, individual contributors, is there were certain qualities that people were cultivating as I got to know them, you know, in classes and as a coach, that really had an impact on how they showed up on the outside. And, you know, how they showed up when they might be calling out, for example, a microaggression, or when they said, you know what, this product is actually not going to make the positive impact that we want. Or I'm not leading from love right now, I'm leading from scarcity. So over time, I saw these qualities, which I like to call the inner game. And I'm not the first person to use that phrase. It actually started off back in the 80s in this book called The Inner Game of Tennis, which was really kind of looking at how did these incredible tennis players develop this really strong game, so to speak. Well, I think the same can be applied at work and in our lives. Like, what's the inner game that's leading you? And then you can see on the outside. And so there could be lots of qualities that I could have picked, but I picked 6 because less is more. And these were the ones that I kept seeing in the folks that I was in service of, but honestly, they're the ones I've been cultivating the most deeply in myself. So we have self-awareness, we have emotional intelligence, which really encompasses empathy and situational and other awareness, and therefore relationship mastery. We have resilience, our ability to bounce back in the midst of complexity, ambiguity, uncertainty. We have love, we have well-being, and we have authenticity. And so when folks are cultivating these qualities on the inside, I feel like they have greater capacity to have the brave exchanges that are needed to create a workplace and a world that works for everyone and is in greatest harmony with the planet. And when I think of conscious and inclusive, they work hand in hand, because it's going to require all of us at the top to solve the big complex problems that we have that are facing all of us. And we can't just have one group in power to do that. It's not going to work, and it hasn't worked.
Very well stated, Carley. So much of what you just shared is really resonating with me. And by the way, we did drop Carley's book, Shine, into the chat. And so certainly make sure that you're taking notice of that. Thank you, Mauricio, for doing that on our behalf. We also put her website, carleyhauck.com, into the chat as well. But I love those 6 qualities that you amplify through your work and through your book. And what really aligns with me is that every single one of those, self-awareness, resilience, every single one of the 6 qualities you named, those are foundational principles of inclusive leadership. And so, and I think that what's really important about the way in which you frame this message is that inclusive leadership is just that. It is and leadership competency. It is a leadership function. And I find that sometimes people don't connect the dots there, because they may, if at the core, if you were to engage them, you could clearly see that they have a level of connectivity to the value of diversity, equity, and inclusion, but they're passive about it. Maybe in that they see it as the responsibility of the person who carries the title of Chief Diversity Officer, Manager, Director, or even maybe the HR professional, right? But instead of being able to see it as a leadership function, leadership by way of influence, which means that regardless of our positions or titles, we can certainly lead and help foster inclusivity in environments that have a strong sense of belonging, so that people can feel that sense of courage and bravery to incorporate into their leadership journey all of those 6 qualities that you talk about. Do you want to react to that? I just love the connection point.
Yeah, thank you. Well, the thing that's really hitting home is that, we can all be leaders right now. And I feel like that is actually the call. We all have a thing or things that we feel an inner fire about, we have a passion for, that is something that we are standing for. But often if we're standing for something, we're also standing against something. And so how are you going to use your privilege, your influence, your social capital to support that thing, whatever that is? And I like to think a lot about, like, how am I'm very service oriented, maybe more than most. I tend to be very altruistically motivated as well. But for me, how am I in service of people? How am I in service of planet? And you can't really see it, but in the back of my room here, I have this plaque, and I'm going to mangle it, but it was given to me years ago by a friend that was traveling in Tibet. And it's a quote by His Holiness the Dalai Lama, but it says something around the fact of, like, we're only here for 90 to potentially 100 years. How are we going to make the best of this life to be really in service of each other and something beautiful, right? That's the opportunity that we all have and the privilege that we all have. And so that is something that I think can awaken the leader in us. Even if it's not a title that we've been given, we just claim that I'm a leader for this.
That is very beautiful. How can we be in service of each other. And to me, it just amplifies the importance of humanity and empathy and compassion. And I feel like that is the core of of a resolve for all of these complex social issues that we're finding ourselves dealing with these days. And so I really love the simplicity of that. How can we be in service of others? You also mentioned, I'm paraphrasing here, that it's important for each of us to make sure that we are standing confidently in our truth and we're standing for things, because there's a saying, if we stand for everything, we're standing for nothing, right? And so I love the fact that you have reckoned and you brought to this conversation the need for standing for something, and realizing that when you stand for something, oftentimes it is also being confident to stand against things that maybe do not align with your value system and your truth and what you feel like is right for all humans. And so I am so glad that you brought that to the conversation.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Can I ask you a question?
Sure you can, Carley.
Well, okay, so this is my first book, right? I'm pregnant. I'm
Yes.
like giving it, you know, and you've had two. And what has been really interesting for me in my experience, and this is where the question comes, is when you write a book, you know, your voice, your view, what you're standing for, and you have to keep talking about it, right? You have to claim it, you have to own it, you have to embody it and live it. It's a really powerful experience. And
Yes.
I feel curious, what's been your experience about that? And where was it maybe difficult even to keep standing in that? Because in some ways, Nika, you were before the curve of all the DEI, you know? There's a bigger wave now.
Yeah, well, there's definitely a bigger wave now, and that can be a whole different conversation, because there's a lot of pluses to that. There's also a lot of cautionary areas that myself and other DEI practitioners are being watchful of. You know, we care about our discipline. There's a lot of respect that goes into the work that we do and how we do it, and we want to make sure that the credence it deserves continues to show forth. But I appreciate the question, and I don't know if I've reflected on this actually in a way that may satisfy the answer you're looking for, but I will say this, it definitely was a process.
I'm not looking for any answer. Just your truth.
Okay.
Yeah, I just want your truth.
Well, good. Well, thank you. Well, thank you, because you're allowing me to be really free. You know, I was intimidated to write my first book, to be honest with you. And the reason why is because, well, now we see this influx of so many practitioners and subject matter experts that are appearing around this topic. At the time when I wrote this book, I felt that I still was relatively new into my journey of being, having a voice of authority in this space, right? And so I struggled a little bit. And I remember talking to my mentor, who's a very astute DEI practitioner, and you know, her counsel to me was, you know, Nika, why are you so frazzled by this? And I said, because I feel like a lot of what I'm saying and the points that I'm bringing up, it's been said before. And she said, but Nika, no one has heard you say it. So put it in your words, align it with your values, align it with what you have experienced. And that was very empowering for me. So just hearing someone say, yes, you know, there's very small number of novel ideas, if you will, right? It's all about how in which we frame it, how in which we engage with it, and maybe, you know, adding some additional components that allows people to reimagine it or think about it differently. But you know, it was, what was freeing for me was just her saying, no one has heard you say it. So walk in that, be confident in that. And it's interesting that right now I have designated 2021 as the year of book number 3. And I'm contemplating around a whole new book, or actually going back and doing a second edition of my first book, because so much has transpired, so much additional learning. And I really feel like I want to go back and redo that. And so that's just kind of what's going on in my head. So I'm interested from this audience, for those of you who are familiar with me and my work, and of course NWC, I would love to get a chat going. So maybe you can help me decide, should I write a different book or should I revisit Intentional Conversation? So Natasha or my colleagues, if you don't mind putting that into the chat, I would just love for this group to oblige and let me know what you think. But I appreciate the question, Carley, I really do. And I'm interested in what your experience was, because for you to have that question, obviously there were some pronounced moments for you that I think you're continuing to hold on to and recall. So if you're willing to share, I would love to hear about it.
Beautiful awareness about that. Well, so this is what just happened. So on Wednesday, I wake up to LinkedIn and I see someone has reposted this article that I wrote for Mindful Magazine, which is on how leaders build trust through authenticity. And I wrote this a few weeks ago. It's an excerpt of my book. And Kathleen Hogan, who is the Chief People Officer of Microsoft, shared it with her entire network.
Wow.
Now, that's huge. So
it's huge.
The reason I'm sharing that is, like, you just never know how your words, how you standing in your truth, what matters to you, is going to resonate for another. And so I feel super humbled and grateful. Thank you, Kathleen, and for all the folks that are now more aware of my work and why this matters to me. And you just never know how it's all going to land. And so now there's going to be all the follow-ups and really understanding what to you and where do you need help, and how can I be in service of that. So
No, I love that. And those are some really powerful moments, to have your work to be regarded in such a way that people are endorsing it just by simply saying, I gained a lot of value from this, and I care about you as someone in my network. I want you to gain the same value. So I always say there's no such, bigger compliment for someone who's a writer and a researcher to have their information to be shared with others. And so I appreciate you sharing that. So yes, I thank you, Kathleen, as well, because as a writer and someone that stands in solidarity with you, I know how important that is. And so thank you for your gift of your book and the work that you're doing. So let's talk about belonging, authenticity, and what the recipe is for leveraging those two to inspire leadership. And you've touched on it briefly, but I really want to dig a little bit deeper, because of all of the 6 qualities that you talk about, I know that authenticity is one that comes up frequently in this conversation of inclusion. So just talk about belonging and authenticity and how it can inspire leadership.
That's a great question. Well, when I think, so going back to the frame of the book and even just my body of work, the inner game rules the outer game, right? So the first 6 chapters of the book really are, how are we cultivating these qualities in ourselves? So when we think about the outer belonging of the workplace, of the world, the only way we can really support that outer belonging is when we belong to ourselves. When we create that inner belonging. I'm here for myself. I am embracing the narcissist, the selfishness, the impatience, the frustration. We all have all these parts, right? We have all these parts. But the more that I can own that's the inner game of authenticity. I can forgive myself for being messy, for not always being the most perfect human, because we're just never going to be that. I'm just going to say that right here. None of us are perfect, neither am I. And the more we can embrace that with acceptance, with compassion, with forgiveness, then when somebody else shows up like that, they're selfish, they're arrogant, they're impatient. They just excluded you and didn't even realize it, right? Or maybe they did.
Yeah.
How can we embrace them as a messy human just like us? We hold them accountable, right, for not creating hurt and harm, but we don't throw them out, so to speak, because that's not really going to solve the problem. And I don't think that supports belonging. And the thing about belonging is that it is just as important as our need for safety and water and shelter. It is a human need. We need it to survive.
Absolutely. I think that's so good, Carley. And I'm reminded of last week, one of our guests on the podcast was David Ryan, Castro Harris, and he talks a lot about restorative justice. And part of his message deals with once we realize we have caused harm to someone, either through conscious bias or unconscious bias, there's an impact there. And it's so important for us who really want to get it right to make sure that we take a moment to reflect and understand what is that impact of the harm that was caused. And then what are the needs of this individual that can help restore the relationship of the person that, again, intentionally or unintentionally, was the one who caused the harm. And so we have to take the time to really reflect on that, because it does have a way of how in which people feel a sense of belonging. You know, we all have the propensity for bias to show up. It doesn't, I say often, it doesn't make us bad people, it makes us human, but it also doesn't exonerate us from the consequences of our actions, which means that we have to prepare ourselves not only to know how to mitigate bias, but when it does occur, because it will occur, what do we do to make sure we are restoring the relationship? And that begins with thinking about what harm has caused, what is the impact of that harm, and what are the needs of the individual in that moment. So you just gave me an opportunity to go back to some really great insights that this community was exposed to last week. So what does it mean to level up our inner game?
Well, I feel like, in the midst of the pandemic, right, and this last year, for those of us that were paying attention to this incredible opportunity that we all just had, right, in a certain way, like we can look at it as, oh, this just happened and it was horrible. Or we can say, no, wait, what were the gifts that the pandemic actually gave us? And when we think about this really coming into ourselves more, we had to. We were in quarantine. We were being asked to turn towards, to really get clear on what matters. There's a up-leveling that can happen from there, right? And so up-leveling the inner game is being willing to do the inner work. And again, can we do the inner work that I've defined in this particular context of these 6 inner game qualities? Like, how can I grow my self-awareness? How can I see that this mindset really has impact on how I show up in the world? How can I grow my emotional intelligence, my empathy? How can I grow greater resilience, which is just more trust and surrender and making sure I'm resourced, because things are always changing. How can I lead from more love towards myself, towards others? How can I make sure that I'm taking good care of this mind, body, heart? That's the inner game of well-being, and recognize that my well-being is contingent upon the planet's well-being. So what am I doing or not doing that is being mindful of my consumption, that is supporting regeneration of soil, that is eating a more plant-based diet, because I know that that is going to reduce the harm to animals and it will reduce climate change. And maybe you don't know any of these things, but that's all in my book. And how do I bolster that inner game of authenticity, which is being willing to say the things that I don't feel comfortable saying, but can I say it from a place of truth and love? I'm not trying to hurt anyone in my authenticity. I'm just owning, this is my experience, this is my perspective, this is my truth. And when I say that, what's the impact on you, right? So we have this opportunity to keep growing and up-leveling, because the more that we up-level where we are on the inside, we have so many more incredible aligned opportunities that come to us. And Nika, I'll just share really briefly, this is me being authentic. So last week, I had 3 things that happened really fast. Like, honestly, 3 relationships that I had felt a bit attached to. They just all got severed, like really fast on Thursday. And because I'm a spiritual being and I have created a little bit of a relationship with Kali Ma, I don't know if anyone knows who she is. She's this incredible Hindu deity. She's known as like one of the dark goddesses, but I don't experience her in that way. She has a lot of fierce compassion, and sometimes that fierce compassion cuts things that are not in your greatest alignment. And it happened, I fell down. Yeah. I cried a bit on Saturday. I was like, what? what the heck just happened there? And then I realized, oh, I'm getting up leveled. That's what's about to happen, because this has happened to me a lot in my life. And then Miss Kathleen, here comes the up leveling. I was like, oh, all right, here we are. I'm just going to bring in some new folks who are going to be in greater alignment with what I'm here to do. So
I love it. What you're describing is the growth mindset, our psyche, our mind has an incredible way of preparing us for experiences that could yield a myriad of emotions for us, right? And we have a decision to make when we encounter those circumstances. Are we going to let this define us, to grow us? Are we going to allow, to linger in that place of discomfort or place of causing us to feel bad about ourselves? And as you mentioned, that does not serve us well, right? Does not serve us well, or the organizations and then spaces and the environments in which we dwell. And so yes, I love that you're standing in your truth and that you're willing to be vulnerable and share that with us today. You've mentioned, as you were talking about those different competencies that you write about in your book, of course, resilience is one. And I find that to be important for us to amplify, especially when we consider all that we are faced with right now as a society and the complexity of those competing complex issues that is causing us to feel triggered in any given moment, causing us to be traumatized and fear and all of these feelings that are hard for us to navigate and process. And so let's talk about the importance of resilience, especially in a time that we're in like now, because I think it's so important for us to focus our minds on not feeling defeated, because we have to maintain hope. So talk about resilience a little bit further, please.
Well, I guess the one thing that I would say is that we all are already resilient. So just to kind of start from that perspective, we're already resilient. And before I totally answer that, I'm just going to give a little experience for folks that are watching. So come back to an experience, and maybe it was last year, maybe it was in the last week, maybe it was in the last day, where something happened to you that was really challenging, and you never thought you were going to be able to work through that, get through that. Does anyone have an experience like that? Yes.
I'm sure all of us do.
We all have that. And guess what? There were certain tools, there were certain people maybe that we relied on, there were certain things that we cultivated to move through that. And we already have that. That's the inner game of resilience. So then can we keep applying some of those skills from the inside to other situations? And can we grow that even more? So some questions that I often will ask, and these are outlined in chapter 3 in the book, is like, when that thing happens and you're just like, oh my gosh, or oh my goddess, I like to say, what am I going to do? Right? How am I going to show up? Who's going to help? The questions that I often will ask is, what's in my control? Like, just stay in the present moment here. Don't try to look at the 3-year journey. Just what's in my control right now? And then instead of going into that, why is this happening to me? How is this for me? That's the growth mindset again. How is this for me? And then really like coming into a space of trust and surrender versus trying to control it, because you can't control it. It's here. And then what's the next inspired step I can take? But that's coming from like being here now, being with it versus avoiding it or going into, all the fixing stuff. But can we be with it first? Can we feel it? Because there's probably some big emotions that we need to actually feel, because there's wisdom behind those emotions.
So I want to do the same for love. We've kind of unpacked resilience a little bit further, but I want to do the same about love. And we know that on your website you identify as Chief Love Officer, and we love that. So can you share more about that and the importance of how do you balance bringing in the concept of love to a corporate business work environment where it may not necessarily always be the first thing that people think of in that type of structured
So I'm getting
environment.
asked this question a lot right now. I got asked it yesterday too. And even with my podcast interview with Tammy Simon, who's the CEO of Sounds True, which is where my book is published, she also asked me, and she knows me very well, but she asked me that question. Well, love is the greatest energy I feel we can emit as human beings. It has a frequency. And all my exchanges, Nika, this is just a reflection. Are you willing to hear it? Okay.
Oh, absolutely.
There's a lot of love that I feel in your energy and what you emit. Even just in the personal correspondences that we have had, there's a lot of love. And I've always been very touched by that, because I try to orient from that place too. And I feel like, what we put out, we attract. So, and in fact, I was attracted to you because of that. Well, which is why I initially reached out to you. It was radiating, so to speak. And I said, Brian, I want to know Nika.
Many of you know Brian McCormack. He's also a friend and a consultant partner to NWC, but he's been on our podcast as well.
Of mine as well. So love, I think, if we're not loving one another, right, then we're hurting one another. That's not what we're here for. And people don't leave companies, they leave bosses. And so when we think about that inner game, if that leader, that boss, that supervisor is not leading from their wholeness, they're leading from imbalance. They might be leading from scarcity or toxicity, right? Like that can have a ripple effect on all the people that one person who has more influence and power and social capital, and that creates disease, dis-ease, in the company. So we have to start with loving ourselves first, right? How do I cultivate more love for myself in my thoughts, in my actions? Because if I'm not loving myself, if my inner critic is going on all the time, guess what is going to happen on the outside?
Yeah, absolutely. We all can identify. I think that probably so many people are shaking their head now saying, yes, that inner critic is real, and it shows up at the most inopportune times. And then it fosters, imposter syndrome and all of these other toxic thoughts and behaviors that then, again, ends up showing forth and how maybe we start reacting or interacting with others. So this is I love everything that you're sharing. We're getting a number of questions that are coming in. I want to encourage this audience to please continue to submit your questions. We're going to be shifting to those momentarily. But I also now want to talk about empathy and compassion. And you talk about compassionate accountability. So let's unpack what that means and why that's important.
Well, I just presented on this topic actually this week to Virginia's annual HR conference. So that was the title of my presentation, and they loved it so much that they asked me to write an article on it. So that's something actually I could share even in the show notes at some point, because it gives a simple framework for how do you have these compassionate accountability conversations. So I don't actually talk about this piece in the book. I talk more about how to create a compassionate boundary, but within that, I think, when you set a boundary with someone, you want to hold it accountable, right? You want to make sure that that boundary isn't broken again. And so because I come and do a lot of work with teams and doing much larger, cultural transformation and programs, when we're putting in agreements and we're working together, we're trying to have a high performing team or be as efficient as possible, we have to make sure that we have an accountability process. And what I was noticing in a lot of the accountability conversations is there wasn't compassion, because when we're trying to put a new system or process in place, we're likely not going to get it right the first time, because we're still actually shifting out of the old way, the old pattern, the old habit. And there's a groove that's kind of been developed. You know, it's like, this is what I want to do, but this is the old familiar. So it might take a little bit to move into that new space. So when I think of compassionate accountability, it's, you know, acknowledging that this was a mistake, or this was a way that didn't work for me. But you don't just leave that person. You kind of like are walking with them as they're learning and growing and moving into that next piece, or then that next step. And what often goes, or rather what I want to say is why people struggle to have the accountability conversations, is because we all have inner critics. And if depending on how I frame it, it could be interpreted as a judgment, as shame and blame, right? Even if I am the most skillful in my delivery of the accountability conversation, and I say, I'm really sharing this for your growth. I really want you to excel in this next, you know, position. I really value this, and this about you. And I still deliver it, and they go, yeah, you know, I have no control over that. So these conversations do go sideways sometimes, but they're still important to have. And that's, I think, why people avoid having them. But if we can bring compassion to ourselves, compassion to the other, and let them know that we're here, you know, in supporting them to be their best selves, and to, you know, follow along with this new set of agreements that we're both agreeing to. That was kind of a long answer, but that's what I have right now.
No, but it's so good. And I'm sure it's so relevant to so many that are joined here today, because you're right. Sometimes those accountability conversations can be really hard. But one of the other implications, if we don't take advantage of having those accountability conversations, is that sometimes people, and I find that more specifically, a lot of people that are part of those marginalized populations don't get the constructive feedback that they need in order to grow and to be on a trajectory of upward mobility and success. I know that I, for one, have had a number of leaders to come to me and say, I want you to be able to mentor this person, because I'm not sure that I'm poised as a white male or even as a white female to provide the feedback that they need, but maybe they'll receive it from you. And so I think there's also, as we talk about just inclusion and equity and opportunity, full opportunity for success for all, we have to address the implications of not having those constructive conversations that everyone deserves as they are on their path of again, just improvement and having full opportunity for success. So I love what you bring to the conversation as it relates to that empathy and that compassion, and not just expecting things to change immediately. Because you're right, we get into a rhythm. That's our habit. That's what we're used to. It's our pattern. So we do have to extend some grace while people are working their way through that. But a lot of people in the audience are really interested in the inner critic that you've referenced a couple of times. And so people want to know, how do you temper the inner critic?
Well, there's some pieces in the book around that. I'll just keep referring to the book. But, you know, the first and easiest way in my experience is, again, it all comes back to that first inner game skill of self-awareness. What am I aware of that I'm thinking, right? Because our thoughts have so much power. Am I telling myself that I'm not good enough on a regular basis? Why? Where's that coming from? Am I, you know, am I telling myself that I am actually doing the very best that I can right now? And I'll be transparent in this journey of being an entrepreneur and author. I mean, I've taken some nosedives, y'all. Like I've had spans of like 2 years where things might just have been really messy. And I wasn't quite finding my footing. And I've noticed in my lifetime, sometimes I'll go back to those years and I'll be like, I wish that hadn't happened. But you know what? I can't wish it away. That's what was happening. That's where I was. And that led me to where I am right now.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. I often talk about the weight of entrepreneurship is really hard. And so, it goes back to what you've amplified several times today, Carley. For those of us who are entrepreneurs or aspiring entrepreneurs, we're going to have to be comfortable with finding whatever those outlets are to give ourselves permission to be okay with that journey of making mistakes, because it is what's going to get us to a level where we are feeling much more confident in our craft and our trade and our ability to lead our organizations and create impact for those in which we're working along with. And so I'm right there with you, and I appreciate that vulnerability. And so here's a question from Sophie. You mentioned the pandemic earlier and how you focused your energy on the upsides or the silver linings. And you seem to be someone who doesn't like to dwell on the negatives and focus on the positives. But do you ever take the time to really reflect on the negatives, the downsides, and any feelings that may be attached to that situation, rather than just immediately moving on from it? And if so, what's the value in doing that,
I
if there is
appreciate
value?
the question. And it seems like your experience of me is that I don't actually live in the difficulty, but I do. And actually, I've had a tremendous amount of difficulty in my life. But for me, because I've had to meet it so many times, I have probably hit the most intense levels of fear, rage, despair, uncertainty, and grief. And I hit actually all of that in 2019. So I hit it before 2020. I had a real leveling in my life, but it just allowed me to be that much deeper so that when those things happen, I can move through them actually much faster, because I've already hit bottom so many times. And what I've learned is that on the other side of all that muck is joy, is freedom. So maybe that's what you're feeling when you hear me talk about it, because I'm like, oh, is that helpful?
Yeah. It was certainly helpful for me, and hopefully, Sophie, the response that Carley provided satisfied what you were looking for in terms of an answer there. If not, let us know into the chat. But again, you sharing your truth, I'm hoping is freeing some people that are witness to today's podcast. Yeah. And our experiences of being in the Valley definitely shapes our outlook when we find ourselves back at that same place again. We begin to draw on, as you mentioned before, that resilience. What allowed us to break through last time we found ourselves at this point? And can we reproduce that type of energy? Can we, reassert ourselves around those tools and the support that allowed us to get through it before?
I think the other piece
So
that I'll
I
just add for
that.
Sophie too is I'm a unique creature in that I spent about 13 years of my life, 2 to 3 weeks a year in silence. So I've had a very deep meditation practice, Dharma practice. And so most people would not feel comfortable to spend that much time with themselves and in silence. Let me tell you, it wasn't always easy. But I chose to do that because I wanted to meet all the pieces. I wanted to be able to sit with actually really intense discomfort so that I could find the freedom in it. And so I had a lot of muscle already built before the pandemic to be able to do that. And it was kind of like this forced silent meditation retreat for many. But I'd been doing it for quite a long time. So I don't say that with arrogance. I just share that that was my path.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you shared that, because I will tell you that every encounter you and I have had so far, every time I have felt this, almost this, it was very tranquil, very calm, that was the energy that you were putting off. And it was refreshing, especially when we think about just the busyness and the chaos and the noise that we are encountering, day in and day out. Sometimes you need someone that can be in your space that can help bring that level of calm. And I've sensed that from you even in today's interview and conversation. And I think that's a true skill set and value that
Well,
many of
thank
us
you.
probably
I
can learn
appreciate
from.
you sharing that even in the midst
So
of my book
yeah,
launch. I don't always feel that, but thank you.
it's coming across very distinctly. So how is climate change imperative for business and social and environmental responsibility? Obviously, this is something that you care deeply about. It's in your book. You've referenced it several times today. So how is it an imperative for business and social environmental responsibility?
So I've been following the climate science for quite a while. I've had some mentors in my life that just kept kind of bringing me to what's been really happening environmentally. And I went through Al Gore's climate reality leadership training a few years ago, and just really have had a deep dive of looking at, when we look at climate change, when we look at pollution, it doesn't discriminate. And it usually impacts those that are lower socioeconomic status, more women, more children, more people of color, more minorities. That breaks my heart, because they don't have maybe as much resources to get themselves to a more safe, place. And in fact, I live in North Carolina now. I'm in Black Mountain, not very far from you, Nika, and I can't wait to come and visit you. We'll have to get that on the calendar. But I moved from the Bay Area, Northern California, where I lived for 14 years. And in September of 2020, Northern California was on fire for an entire month. And what do I mean by that? You can't go outside.
Yeah.
You're wearing masks. We were wearing masks in California long before the pandemic hit. I mean, I had the best mask for 4 years, an N95, before we were told we had to wear masks on a regular basis. And it's real, and it's not going anywhere. And we have to actually cut emissions by 50% in the next 10 years, or we will have so much suffering as a human race. And I don't share that to scare y'all. It's just the truth. And it's undeniable. Climate science is real. And that's why we have such a huge imperative from Biden right now, from the cabinet, to say, okay, how are we going to create a green economy? How are we going to have more electrical vehicles? How do we start to regenerate the soil? Because guess what? When we can regenerate the soil, we're able to take the carbon out of the atmosphere and put it into the ground versus where it's going, which is in the ocean, which is why the ocean is actually becoming acidic and things aren't able to live there. And we're not going to have fish in 10 years. So this is the imperative of business, because we can't do business if we don't have clean water, clean air, and healthy soil to eat from. The well-being of us is very much linked to the well-being of our environment. We are interdependent. And so for me, writing this book was, let's wake up. Let's recognize we're all connected. We're all in this together. We all need to come together. And business is the largest lever of power, of influence to create the changes our world needs now. And the panel, Nika, that I invited you to was with some folks very much in the business for good, the B impact space, the B Corp space, because they're doing it right. They have this whole set of commitments and guidelines of how do we align our business so that it is, being best for the world, so that it's adhering to certain commitments that are supporting, environmental and social responsibility. And if any of you, by the way, are interested in learning more, they have on the B Corp website, and actually it's on my website as well in the resource sections, there's the free B Impact Assessment. you can just take it and kind of get like a baseline. How's my business doing?
Mm-hmm. I love that you brought that to the conversation. I know that we're at the top of the hour, but I will tell you that after participating in your panel, I literally went back and I became really smart on what is B Corp movement. And I share it with my teammates. I want us to be on this trajectory. And so we're looking into it now. We're trying to prepare ourselves. And so, but yeah, business for good. And I love the message. I love the movement. And I think that we need to do more to help socialize that as an opportunity.
That's
So I'm
so
so glad you
wonderful.
brought it
I
up
love that
in this
that had that
conversation.
impact on you. And Nika, Ryan is wonderful. I believe you have his email, but I'm sure he'd be willing to have a conversation with you about that if you need
Yes,
any
I
support.
do. Yes. Oh, you're so kind. I appreciate that. We will, I'm sure, be reaching out to Ryan. And yeah, it's important. And I'm so glad again that you brought that to the surface. It's a great note to end on. So Carley, this has been amazing. I'm so grateful for your time. I'm grateful for your insight and all that you do in this space to help people to really channel their the strong sense of belonging for self so that they are not pouring from an empty cup. And I value what you're doing. And I'm so grateful. I cannot wait to be able to delve deep into my book. Again, I want to put it up here for all of you. Shine, it is in the chat. We will also make sure that this information is available and the follow-up email that goes out to each of you that attended today's session. I want to give you an opportunity for the final parting remarks, but I'll just quickly say to this community, as always do, I'm grateful for you. We're grateful for you at NWC. Join us next week with Bernadette Smith, and we look forward to
Nika,
staying connected to this community. Carley,
the
last
only thing
remarks.
that I just wanted to say, if folks actually would love to have more dialogue around some of the essences of the book, I have a few free community events that I am hosting and moderating. Nika, you were part of the first one, but we have 3 more. I might even add another because they're so much fun. They're a lot of work, but they're a lot of fun. Our next one is on Wednesday with Jennifer Brown, who is a friend of both of ours, another DEI consultant, thought leader, good friend. And Ria Singhal, who is also a leader in my book. She started the first compostable tableware company in India, and then Meeta Malik, who is Inclusion of Carta, head of Inclusion of Carta. I apologize, Meeta. And that is on the important topic of gender equity in the future of work. As we know, we lost a lot of women towards caregiving responsibilities in the midst of the pandemic. So how are we going to reckon that? And then there's a few more events, but if you go to carleyhauck.com/community-events, then you can register for these free events. If you can't attend the live conversation, then a recording will be sent out to you. So I'd love to have you join. And I guess the last thing that I would just say is, you know, this time that we're in, it's a really pivotal time for transformation. It's a real important time, I think, to get clear on what we're standing for, what we're standing against. And then, as I always like to say, be the light and then shine that light. Because we all need everyone's light right now.
Thank you. Take care, everyone.